Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the second in our series of Rev-Ops webinars. For me, Rev-Ops is one of the most exciting places to be playing at the moment. There's an awful lot of traction and fun to be had with something that absolutely makes sense for your business. Today, we're starting to look at the age-old question, how do I scale? But more importantly, how do I use Rev-Ops to help me scale? With me today, I have HubSpot's very own Maggie Butler. Maggie knows Rev-Ops. She knows what it can do for your business, how to structure teams around it, and how to position it in the market. You're going to learn a lot from her today because you'll get insight into how one of the fastest growing tech companies, HubSpot, thinks about Rev-Ops. Just before I hand over to Maggie, a quick bit of housekeeping. We'll be using the Q&A panel for questions. So anything you want to ask, please throw them in the Q&A panel. That way we can make sure we get to your questions. We can double back on them and make sure that nothing gets missed. And at the same time, please keep up with the chat. If you agree on anything, you've got a point to share while Maggie's talking, throw it in the chat. The more that you engage in the session, the better it'll be and the more you'll get out of it. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Maggie. Maggie, welcome. I'm really excited about this one. So thank you for joining us.
Richard, I'm very excited too. Thank you very much for that nice introduction and for having me today on your second webinar in this series. I am thrilled to be here representing HubSpot. You also can see my two dogs who are my coworkers. They're sitting behind me. They say hello too. I'm really excited today to talk to you all about the operations industry and most importantly, the rise of this Rev-Ops or revenue operations term that you've been hearing. But before we get in and I get a little bit ahead of myself there, I wanted to start at the beginning and share with you my Rev-Ops story. So like Richard said, I'm a HubSpotter. I'm very lucky to have been here for about 8 years now. I started my career in tech and in kind of social media marketing at other companies, both in startups and public companies like LogMeIn is one you may have heard of. And I worked there as a product manager as well as a product marketer. And at HubSpot, I moved into marketing operations and I stayed there for about 5 years. And so you might be thinking, product management and product marketing led you to marketing operations? Those things do not seem very connected at all, besides the term marketing in them. But if you're in operations today, or you know or love someone who is, you might already know that the background of any given operations person can be varied and vastly different than the next person that you meet. And so even though these profiles are different, all operations professionals today have at least one thing in common. They're underwater, they're overwhelmed, and their industry is ready for a change. A little bit about these folks, if you know an operations professional, you probably already know they're likely dragged down by tech debt that you've built up at your company. It's so easy to build up tech debt. We'll talk about that. They're siloed from each other in the business. So you might know an operations person who sits in marketing ops. You might know someone who sits in sales ops. They're usually very siloed and disconnected from each other. Absolutely generally underappreciated by leadership. These folks are powerhouses, but they're generally stuck doing very reactive busy work, like fixing integrations, completing 18 steps of a manual process, or even something as simple as just editing buttons in your CRM. These are the general jobs of these folks. But I'm here to tell you today something you might have already heard about or are starting to discover. Your operations team is really the key to your success as a business. You want to grow your business, you want to scale your business, you need operations to do it. When you're trying to build your company, grow your company, scale your company, you need operations to do the key jobs that need to be done here, like manage the platforms that you use, design the processes that sit on top of them, and then give the business the perspective it needs in order to be innovative and continue growing forward. And what's interesting is that a lot of companies today who are looking to scale their business, they're not really set up effectively to really support operations teams. They may have only had one operations person or even a whole team. That doesn't mean you're set up the right way. So if that's you, it's time for a transformation, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So let me get right into it. I talked a little bit about scale. So let's start there. Most companies want to scale, right? Things are going well, they want to grow the business. But how does a company actually scale? What is the answer to that? And so let's talk about what scale really is. What exactly do I mean when I say the word scale? Well, scale occurs when a business growth exceeds investment growth. What I mean by that is It's when users, partners, customers, and revenue grow faster than the investments that you make in those areas. And this is dreamy, right? This sounds awesome. This means that if you can achieve this, that you've built a really effective internal machine that's working for you and also working for your customers, allowing you to scale. But sounds dreamy, and it's a lot easier said than done. Not a lot of companies have been able to effectively make this transition from growth to scale. Why? It's really hard, and there's no playbook. Oh, that's the most important thing. There's no playbook for scale. This is uncharted territory for a lot of companies. And so remember this slide, remember this graphic. We're going to come back to it. So it's hard. And let's talk more about what those other challenges are that come with trying to scale. I've got 3 for you today that we at HubSpot identify as what I would call the hardest problems companies are facing today when scaling up. The first one is the customer experience challenge. Man, the reason that the customer experience tends to get lost as companies grow is because these functional operations teams are set up in silos, and they end up approaching the customer experience from their own silo. Our EVP of Revops, Allison Elworthy, calls this a function out strategy. So let me give you a really tangible example of this that I think I know I felt, and I'm wondering if other folks have too. So you're having a problem with something that you've purchased, or you have a question for a company, and you go on their website, maybe they have a chat bot, and you have a whole conversation with somebody. This recently happened to me when I was trying to upgrade my cell phone. So you have a whole conversation on the website, and then a couple of days later, you need to talk to somebody again. So you give them a call, you finally get somebody on the phone, and you have to repeat the entire conversation that you just had with somebody else on their website on the phone. That is the worst. That is because those companies are set up in a silo. They've got one team handling the chatbot conversations. They have another team who are talking to you on the phone. And those conversations are not being connected, whether the tech behind it isn't connected, the teams aren't working together. That is a very tangible example of how the customer experience can get lost as you try to build your company. So it's also a challenge for companies to stay big and fast while they're trying to scale. So imagine this, you're a small company, and it's really easy in a small company to work very closely with your peers and innovate and launch new ideas. If you've ever sat in an office, right? Think about an office setting. You're surrounded by people you work with closely. Oh, this kind of feels like a dream a little bit at this point. But you might remember how easy it was to make decisions, right? You turn to the person on your right. Hey, we should change the way that website title is or looks or whatever. Oh yeah, okay, let me make that change. Boom, it's done. It's very easy to make decisions and then implement them at the same time. Those two things are very different, but it's very easy when you're small. However, let's say you open another office. Let's say you start to add more headcount. Those things get very hard to do at scale. It's really hard to keep up the processes and the way that you've been working as you continue to grow if you don't take care to consider what's actually happening. So all of a sudden, companies that were very nimble at the start to grow into something that's actually big and slow, when they really want to just try to be big and fast and continue to have that sort of innovative way of working, even though they're adding more people, more processes, and more things. Efficiency is the third challenge. So when you think about growth, close your eyes, the most obvious way for a company to grow is to invest in headcount. But this linear way of growing, gosh, it's not only expensive, but it's unsustainable, and it doesn't work when you want to scale. So I'm pulled this slide back up. If you remember this slide from before, so take a look at that blue line. Imagine that blue line is headcount and the orange line is revenue. So the linear way of growing, right, means you're hiring more headcount as your revenue grows. But that's not sustainable. That's not how you scale, right? So I encourage you, take a moment to think right here. Well, I'm actually going to grab a sip of water. If you were to make this chart for your company right now, your revenue against your headcount, what would it look like? Are you set up to make that orange line really go up and to the right for revenue, or are you set up to just sort of continue that relationship as you scale? This is important. This is a real key to trying to break linear growth. Okay, so we said the challenges to scale were keeping the customer experience as you grow, staying big and fast and not big and slow, and trying to break linear growth, trying to break that relationship between revenue and headcount. So hairy challenges, right? And do you know who is usually tasked with solving all of these problems as time goes on? Spoiler alert, right? It's your operations team. And like I mentioned before, it's likely these teams at your company, these professionals that you work with, are not set up for success today. They're overwhelmed, and they're often reactively fighting problems that's caused by this friction that happens when you try to scale, just to sort of keep the flywheel spinning. One way I think that's important to talk about where they're really not set up for success is, gosh, operations folks are wrangling a ton of tools. I mean, over 100 in both mid-market and enterprise companies, and likely more, especially after this year, where it's very easy to just adopt free and paid tools to sort of plug those gaps in your platforms. But, you know, I think about one of my responsibilities on marketing ops was to wrangle the entire suite of tools that marketers used, free and paid, and make a central repository of who owned it, how much it cost, how many seats we had of it, and all of the renewal information. So we did this in a real effort to make sure that we weren't, you know, spending money that we didn't need to spend buying duplicate tools, and to streamline the processes of permissioning, how folks ask for new software. This was a very, very painful process at HubSpot. We have a really large marketing team. So imagine trying to talk to every single marketer on the team. Hey, you know, besides HubSpot, what tools are you using on a daily basis? Are they free? Are they paid? Who else uses them? How much are you paying? When is the renewal up? This is really difficult and a manual process to manage. And likely it's your operations person who's doing that, and it takes up a ton of their time. So I wouldn't want to share all these problems with you and all of this strife, right, without giving you a better option or an alternative way of working, because there is a better way. I've been watching it happen at HubSpot right now. I've talked to as many of these ops professionals like myself that I could kind of get my hands on in the last year or so. And I'm here to tell you that, yes, there is a solution. And that solution is revenue operations, or Rev-Ops for sure. I'll probably just call it Rev-Ops to save some breath, but you'll see it kind of both ways. And so what is Rev-Ops, right? Like, is it, a lot of times I get the question like, do I really need to learn about what this is? Is this going to be another word or another fad that kind of comes and goes? And like, I kind of need to know it now, but I won't need to know it in a couple of years. Heck no, Rev-Ops is here to stay. So at HubSpot, we think about Rev-Ops like this. We define it as the mindset, the practice, and the manifestation of unifying your internal operations. So what's important there is that Rev-Ops is something that you can believe in. It's something that you can practice at your company. And it's something that when you put those two things together, really manifest the way that a company looks to scale. So, you know, in the old world, when you think about, you know, pre-Rev-Ops or before Rev-Ops, operations folks operated within their silos. And that probably is still maybe something that's happening at your company today, and it still happens everywhere, right? You've got the marketing operations department, the sales operations department. More and more, we're seeing customer success ops kind of pop up. And when they operate in this way, kind of operating in these functions, Allison Elworthy, our EVP of Rev-Up, she calls this a function out strategy. And it's the reason that the customer experience tends to get lost, right? That example of, hey, I'm chatting with you, hey, I'm calling you, and you don't know what I said. You don't have any way to like see the information that I already gave you. Ugh, that doesn't feel good. And this is happening because these functional operations teams are set up in silos, and they're just trying to solve for the customer with what they own, what they can do from their perspective. But with Rev-Ops, all that changes. And in this new world, with Rev-Ops, you can actually remove those silos and come together as one team, one operational team, to really think about, okay, what are our responsibilities? What are our emotions? What is our go-to-market strategy to continue to kind of solve for the customer? With Rev-Ops, you can actually build your go-to-market strategy based on the way people really want to buy. And we call this a customer in strategy as opposed to a function out strategy, which is really cool. And so, you might be wondering, oh, this sounds good, right? But like, how does RevOps specifically, man, it's a tough word, help companies run better, right? RevOps is changing the world right now and helping these companies in the world of operations scale in a couple ways. The first thing, like I just talked about, we're integrating these siloed go-to-market operations into one team. And then what we can do there is we can build that unified operating rhythm for the company, right? Because when you unify those teams under one roof, all of a sudden it's about one mission, one winning aspiration, one strategy that we're all really aligned around, and you become a very unified RevOps team. You might have heard this saying before, we say it a lot at HubSpot, which is culture eats strategy for breakfast, right? Like you can have a great strategy, but I mean, culture is really where it's at. But now here at HubSpot, Yamini Rangan, our chief customer officer, we sort of evolved that thinking a little bit. And now what we're saying, alignment eats strategy for lunch, right? Alignment and having a unified team wins every time over an amazing strategy. Everyone's got an amazing strategy. Everybody's got, oh, this is going to work for us. This is our idea. But man, if you don't have every single person at your company believing in that strategy, working on that strategy in the same way, we call it aligning our vectors. If your vectors aren't aligned, you're not going to be able to pull anything off. So kudos that you've got a great strategy, but how are you actually pulling that off? You need alignment, specifically alignment with those go-to-market operations teams. They are the backbone of what you're doing. So, you know, we care about alignment so much, and when you think about those challenges I mentioned before, alignment is really how you overcome that speed challenge in that scaling world. And it's how you stay big and fast. Imagine, right? You add more offices, you add more headcount. It's easy to get unaligned. It's easy for those silos to sort of develop in your company. Everybody's got the right intention. Everybody wants to provide a great customer experience. Everybody wants to, you know, solve for the customer and make sure that the work that they're doing is really impactful. But it's hard to make a true impact if you're not aligned. So RevOps is also really about aligning systems and data and enablement. Enablement is so key. Enablement to drive that efficiency so that you can continue to stay big and fast and not big and slow. Innovation is a big one too. Like RevOps is also the key to allowing time for innovation in a customer first way, right? And this is, I think, where the real magic of RevOps can happen. If you're an operations professional, you know that, gosh, most of the work that you do is just trying to maintain what is going on. A lot of the manual processes fall on you. A lot of the work that you do is like, how do I keep that up? How do I keep that going? And it doesn't leave a lot of room for these folks to say, hey, I've got an eye into all these things that are happening. I think we should change this. I think we should try this. But that is what that team is really built for. They have a bird's eye view into everything. I mean, they're the backbone. So what's really great about RevOps is it allows for that time to innovate. You know, you unify your teams, you get aligned, you add in motions like automation to kind of take that manual work off these folks. And now all of a sudden, in a 40-hour work week, we've actually got time to do innovative work. And now it's the first time that your operations team doesn't just have to keep the flywheel spinning, but they can actually make innovation to make it spin faster and faster. So this is how operations folks are freed up to work on the big, ambitious ideas that are needed to break that relationship between headcount and revenue and really break linear growth. So, you know, all in all, RevOps really moves these operations professionals from a place of being like a reactive firefighter, right? Who is just trying to keep it spinning. That's all they're trying to do. But with RevOps, it allows them to free up a little bit of time and proactively remove that friction with new innovative ideas to help your flywheel just go faster and faster. So I just want to summarize what I said so far. A lot of these are new ideas. So scaling is hard, right? Maybe you're feeling it today. Maybe you're getting ready to scale your company. It's hard. And when companies go to scale, your operations folks get buried. They just do. And to scale better, you need to run better. And you need to unleash your ops teams to help you run better. And RevOps is the way to do that. but how do you actually do RevOps, right? At HubSpot, when we see a scaling challenge like this and an underserved persona like operations folks, we try not to just write the new playbook. We also build the software to execute the playbook too. So that's where Operations Hub comes in. I know Richard's going to talk more about Operations Hub in the future, but that's how the RevOps idea and the strategy plays into the way that we're thinking about operations today.
Maggie, that was awesome. I think there's a lot of takeaways out of there. I've got like a bunch of questions.
Awesome.
Dave has already put one in the comments as well. So just I'll start off with Dave. So what have you found to be the biggest challenge in integrating a RevOps strategy? Because I had a very similar question saying like, what are some of the pitfalls when somebody thinks about rolling out RevOps? Where should they be wary?
Yeah. So, Allison Elworthy, who's our EVP of RevOps, she is really leading the charge of making this work in-house. And I'll tell you from what I've seen, the first thing that I think is very easy to say, but can be difficult in practice is really getting the unification and alignment of your teams down. If you are currently in an operations department today, I kind of coming from marketing ops, I think from that angle, I also have worked quite closely with sales operations. And it can at the start feel like those teams are doing very separate things, very, very different things. And all of a sudden, when you start to take a step back, you're able to see some similarities across the work that they're doing. And I think that just the mindset of having folks stop thinking about their silos and working in that function out way to kind of come together to align on the work they're doing, unify under one roof, that's really the first step of RevOps. And it's not always easy. Changing the way that folks are structured internally is one thing. Changing the mindset of how folks work is a whole other. So obviously here at HubSpot, we're all bought into RevOps and everybody's very excited about it. And then getting into actually doing it is part of the first hard work that you need to do.
What are some of the metrics or like KPIs that RevOps should be focusing on? Where, like, if you were leading a business, what are some of the like metrics you would expect to be improving by bringing RevOps into your business?
Yeah, so I'm going to answer it this way, which is one of the things that you'll do when you institute a RevOps department or a RevOps organization is you're going to take a look at all of the metrics that matter to the goals that you've set as a company. So the first thing that you're going to need to do is set what your goals are. But the most important thing about metrics and KPIs in that is you want to be able to sort of tie it all back to the way that you're making money. And I think that it's quite difficult to get a whole group of people aligned on sort of the core metrics that matter. But the way that you start doing that is to take each department and figure out, okay, what are the metrics that we track? And then take a look at, well, what are the ways that revenue is actually coming into the company? And how can we make one revenue model and sort of tie everything back to one metric, one revenue model, or a set of metrics rather, that help us stay aligned and push forward. So I don't think that there's any necessarily one answer, but I do think that being able to really get on the same page with everybody about what matters for tracking and then what doesn't, right? You'll find that a lot of folk, you've all heard the term vanity metrics. And some companies' vanity metrics are another company's absolute, like, yes, actually, we really need to be tracking that based on what we do, what we sell, how we want to scale, and with the money that we're making. So I would encourage folks to, before you think about, well, it should be this, take a look at what you're tracking, take a look at what everybody's looking at, and see if you can come together and say, hey, based on the way that we're trying to grow and the metrics that we have, what should we really be looking at? What do we all agree that's very important for us to track and stay on top of? And then how can each team under RevOps, because even though you're under a RevOps organization, there's still folks that are dedicated to different functions. Like here at HubSpot, we've got sales, marketing, and service ops that are under one roof, but we also have two other teams that are involved in our RevOps department. One of them is enablement. And it's so important that when you're unified as an operations team, that you're enabling folks in a very similar way across the organization that helps you stay aligned. The other team that we have is go-to-market strategy. Allison Elworthy, during her stint in customer success before Rev-Ops, built this team called the Voice of the Customer. And at HubSpot, everything that we do is to solve for the customer. Customer first, always, always. But it's very easy to say that. And it's not always easy to actually build a go-to-market strategy based on the voice of the customer. That's why that team is in our Rev-Ops department, so that all of the work that we're doing to power our teams internally truly, truly, truly solve for the customer.
How do you, so when you say that kind of, it's not always easy to use the voice of the customer to, as a, like the go-to-market or even to help define the product. How do you balance that between, this is totally off this is out of interest, it's not really RevOps anymore, but like, if you look at like the Henry Ford quote, like if I'd asked my customers what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. Like, how do you balance between what the customer's asking for, but what you know is a innovation or a different change? Like, how do those two things balance out?
Yeah, it's not easy. I think one of the things that I think where people struggle with that is that they don't actually have a very good process for listening to the customer, distilling that feedback, and then aligning that feedback to the initiatives or that we either have or have not going on internally. You know, if you ask an operations person today, who's your customer? They're going to say, oh, well, it's my marketing team, it's my sales team. But really, their customer is the customer, right? Everything that they do is in service of the customer. They're enabling the marketers, the sales folks, the services folks to do the work that's needed to solve for the customer. So how you begin to reconcile that is get a program together where you're consistently gathering feedback, whether that's through NPS surveys and customer success, whether that is quarterly customer advisory boards. There's a million ways to do it, but the most important thing is, if we're listening, what are the actual motions that you're taking to actually make those changes in-house? You know, not everything that a customer says you're going to be able to do, but if you can really understand why they're saying it. One of the things you learn as an operations person, someone comes to you and says, I have this problem, I need you to build me this workflow. Well, let's back up, right? Like, what are you actually trying to do? Because 9 times out of 10, building the workflow or whatever the proposed solution is not actually the right solution. It's really just the first thing that somebody thinks about in order to like stop the pain and to sort of erase the friction that's there. But your charter as an operations professional is to say, okay, what is the real like crux of this issue? And what is the solve that is going to make it easy for us internally to solve for the customer? And I say easy, but I really sort of mean doable or attainable, or something that you can actually implement that will make a difference and an impact.
Ravi's got a great question here. So how would you start the RevOps function if you were in charge? Who would be the key hires, and what would you think is important to have in place to ensure alignment across the team?
Whoa, okay, couple questions in there. Let's talk about skill sets first. So, you know, I mentioned that a lot of operations folks have varied backgrounds. And so, you know, when you're looking for a RevOps team or you're thinking about a RevOps hire, there's a couple of key skills I think are needed. I won't touch on all of them, but I'll touch on the key ones. I think the first one is being data literate. So you'll notice that a lot of operations folks are heavy into data analytics, really understand how to read data, and more importantly, understand how to get insights from their data. Everybody knows that you can put together a chart, right? Even HubSpot it allows really anyone to say, hey, I want to see this data in this way. But for RevOps, it's not just about enabling people. It's not just about picking the right reporting software or enabling people to use it. It's what are the insights that we're getting out of this? What is the history of this chart? What are we seeing change over time? And what does that tell us about what we need to be doing in the business? So some of that's curiosity. Some of that is being very data literate, data analytics focused. You definitely need someone like that. I think the other thing that is easy to say but hard to do is focus on that alignment piece. So, I mentioned that some of my background was in product marketing and product management. One skill that I've really built up over those years is working cross-functionally. And that's not always easy either, to be able to wrangle groups of people, to influence them, to have them work together when seemingly they're working on all different things. So being data literate, communication is a big one. I think those are two things that you just start to look for. So if you're thinking today about instituting a Rev-Ops department or an organization, the very first thing that you need is buy-in. Like, you don't have to start organizing your company under one Rev-Ops person immediately. It's sort of like inbound marketing, right? Like, you have to believe that it's going to work, and you have to believe that fundamentally the way people buy software has changed, the way that operations folks work today are wrong. Like, you really truly need to have felt that pain or believe in that mindset to move forward. And I think that the buy-in piece is tough, and it can take a little bit. You need data, you need return on investment, you need use cases, you need examples, and you really need an internal champion to start to kind of wrangle all that. Anybody can be an internal champion for Rev-Ops. You don't have to be a VP or a CEO or anyone, but you do need to be able to put together a package of information that says, hey, man, the way that we're working today, it's causing these problems. And if we were to adopt a Rev-Ops mindset, here are the ways that that could be impactful. So skill sets, thinking about alignment as that first step. Those are two ways I'd get started.
When do you think RevOps becomes relevant to a company? Like, is there a tipping point? Like, or would you say companies should start with this now? Or like, where does it become a thing for companies?
Yeah. So, from what the conversations that I've had, you usually start to hire someone to probably start as like kind of like they might be called an admin, but it's really administrative tasks that they're doing in terms of managing your tech stack, permissions, trying to figure out how folks work with that. That's usually one of the first hires that sort of starts to feel like operations. I mean, then, right? Because one of the things that you'll either have felt as an operations professional today, or that you'll learn from talking to other people, is that we have gotten to this place of being underwhelmed and underwater and underappreciated because we've just built up bad habits and built up work within these functions. So the best advice I can give someone who's thinking about this today, whether they don't have any operations people at their company, or they're like, okay, I've got these functions, I need to figure out how to change into RevOps, break down the silos. Start with a very, a mindset where you're hiring and staffing folks to work together, even if they support marketing, even if they support sales. Those two people are working together to do the same motions that enable their teams, using the same tools, thinking about the same processes, tied to the same goals. So usually when you've got 5 or more people, you hire somebody to start helping you do that admin type work of just making sure that things start to run internally. That's a prime time to start thinking about RevOps.
Halima's just asked a great question as well in the chat. Once you start aligning your teams, how do you make sure everyone stays aligned? And how do you create accountability without creating silos?
Yeah. So the answer that I usually give to this is not one that anybody likes. And it's just the word. It's documentation. So one of the things that is so important as an operations professional is being able to be transparent about what you're doing and the way and how things work. Imagine that you hire an operations person who doesn't do any documentation. You've hired them to manage your CRM. You've hired them to build processes on top of that CRM that allow your marketers to use it and your sales reps to enter data into it and reporting to happen from it. And then you all of a sudden become the person that sort of innovates on those processes over time, reports to leadership how things are going. If that person left tomorrow, whew, you'd be in trouble, because now you don't have anybody to sort of continue that work, but also they're the backbone of what you're doing. And I think a lot of times people feel who don't do documentation or who don't know how to do it right, they're thinking, oh my God, I don't want to write down all this stuff. Like it's going to be a bear to maintain it. But in reality, that's one of the ways that you truly stay aligned. Yes, it's about meetings. Yes, it's about being able to, talk out what's happening and kind of stay on the same page. But the transparency of something like documentation, documenting how this process works, how that process works, even just to start, you might have a situation right now where you do have a couple functional silos and you say, okay, well, I've got this RevOps mindset. I totally believe that this is how this is going to work. You need those folks to write down and really document what they're doing so that you can say, wow, Mary on the marketing ops team and Chad on the sales ops team, like they're actually doing the same thing kind of, and they actually run the same processes, but that person's doing it this way and that person's doing it that way. And that's where some real magic can happen, because those two people can come together and say, oh, this is how you are helping people use the CRM. This is how I'm doing it. Let's share those things. Let's just make these processes the same. And now everybody's doing it this way. And it also helps the folks on the other side of the table, meaning the go-to-market reps, whether that's a marketer or a salesperson. It makes them really confident in the work that you're asking them to adopt and that you're enabling them to do, because they can really understand why it's happening and they can very clearly see how it works. Part of another skill that I think is so important as a RevOps professional is influence. A lot of times those RevOps folks or your operations professionals, they're not going to, the marketers don't roll up and report into them. The sales reps don't directly report into them either. But man, if they can't work together to come up with, ways of working that feel really good, it's going to be hard to integrate those mindsets together and integrate that work. So you want to look for somebody who can really understand what people need and influence the way other people work so that everybody can kind of work together.
On the same topic of super sexy documentation, are there any specific standards? This is from Bashard. Are there any specific standards for documentation in RevOps? Is there a kind of a true North Star or somebody who's doing it really well, or a process that you should follow?
Yeah. So this is why I love operations, because this is why you're seeing communities, whether that's within HubSpot, whether that's something like Rev Genius or the Revenue Collective. This is why operations folks are so involved in communities today, because there is no playbook for stuff like that. The operations industry doesn't have such a rich history as something, let's say like marketing or sales. Like, let's say you've graduated from college and you say, okay, I want to be a CMO one day. There's a very clear path that you can take, that you've watched other people take, to say, okay, the first thing I do, I'm an associate marketing manager. Then I'm here, then I'm here, then I'm here, then I'm here, then I'm a VP, then I'm an SVP. When you want to be great or become the head of the RevOps department, whether that's a CRO or something else, there aren't a lot of like very well-known trajectories or career paths. And what that means is there's not a lot of great examples or use cases or even templates and resources when it comes to doing this stuff. I can't tell you how many times I've been on the phone with a HubSpot customer and I said, I manage all of the vendors in marketing and I have a spreadsheet that looks like this. And they'll say, can I have a copy of it? Because that would help me just get started in doing it. And I think that that's really how people are finding their North Star or the right way to do it. There isn't necessarily always a right way to do it. But if you can find somebody else in the industry who's done what you've done and get their example, you can really see, okay, this is how this worked for them. Well, my company's set up just a little bit different. So let me change this column. Let me add this in here. And now all of a sudden you've got something that, you can kind of feel good about because someone else has done it. But now it's also become your own in a way to do it. So a true North Star for documentation, right now I'd say just make sure you're doing it. Make sure that every process that someone is running to get something done or to enable somebody else is documented. That will help you now. It will greatly help you in the future. It'll also save you a ton of time and a ton of manual work in ways that you can't even anticipate.
Khadijah's asked a great question as well. What thoughts do you have on choosing someone internally to lead the charge on RevOps versus hiring externally? Is there a route that is typically more successful?
I would say this. So it's usually the way that someone internally starts to do tasks that are RevOps because the need arises and somebody has to do it. So I'd say that from a success standpoint, the way to be successful at it is to hire or have the right person to do it. But that's not necessarily how it always starts. It usually starts out of somebody saying, hey, whose job is it to write down all these vendors? Whose job is it to do this? And everyone will say, well, I don't know, somebody's got to do it. And then usually there's one person who says, okay, it's so painful for me that I'm just going to do it, or I'm going to step up and do it. That person could be your most successful person. I mean, of course, there's something to be said for having someone who really understands the way that you already work. That can be very helpful in influencing others to change. On the other side of the coin, the way that you're usually working likely isn't working. And that's why you're thinking about this, or that's why you know you need a change. And it can be very, very enlightening to have somebody on the outside who has some experience in what you're doing come in and say, hey, I get that this works for you right now, but if you were to start this over again, would you do it the same way? Probably not. Let's sort of institute a new way of working here. So I think both can be successful. I think it's just about finding that right person to do the job, whether that's already in-house or you want to look externally too.
So last question I have from the group, unless anybody else
Okay.
has got any other questions to add, but last one, how can RevOps make long-term strategic planning easier or better?
Yeah. I'll tell you the first thing that comes to mind is, what we're working on right now in our HubSpot organization is defining one operating rhythm for everybody. So, we talk about that function out strategy, and usually functions, these silos, they've built up their own annual, quarterly, monthly planning process. But that doesn't really work when you're trying to align and unify all of your, platforms, processes, and the perspectives that you're getting from everybody. So long-term success comes from having one operating system where you very clearly define, hey, this quarter is about experimentation and ideation. The next quarter is about looking at those results and making a plan. That third quarter is about getting buy-in to the plan for next year's plan from leadership and management. And then the fourth quarter is figuring out how to roll it out to the teams. Rinse and repeat, rinse and repeat, rinse and repeat. That might not exactly work for you, but what will work is coming up with a unified and aligned way to do it across all departments that maybe satisfy and may have a compromise between what everybody needs. But if you can get into that one unified operating rhythm, that's where you're really going to see success.
I lied about the last question. There is
Okay.
one more that's just snuck in.
Okay.
It's one we get asked at pretty much every webinar when we've covered an interesting topic. You mentioned the Revenue Collective already, but are there any other resources or communities that you'd recommend people dig into?
Yes. HubSpot. So I'll have to plug our own. So yeah. So one of the things that, if you're familiar with the HubSpot community, you might know it as a place to go for product support. We're growing, we're changing, we're evolving. And one of the things I've been working on in the last couple of years is carving out a place for us in the HubSpot community for folks, whether you use the HubSpot product or not, to really come and talk about operations topics. One of the things that we do events on all the time is automation. Automation is cool, it's easy to set up, it's very easy to go bad, it's very easy to not have a strategy, and it's very easy to fizzle out and sort of just not really work for you well. So we're trying to really get all of these awesome RevOps insights that are happening inside HubSpot like this and really bring them to the public. So if you're interested in how HubSpot is learning about RevOps, doing RevOps, and how things are going, definitely join us over there. I'll post the link in a chat in a sec. Yes, the Revenue Collective is a great resource. That's a paid community. I'd say Rev Genius is where a lot of folks are today too. That's a free community on Slack where they also hold a lot of events and have a lot of play. I mean, Sales Hacker, the Rev-Ops Co-op, there's definitely a lot of places where people are gathering to share resources and to talk to each other. And that is a real testament to the operations community. One of the things I mentioned, right? Like there's no playbook for these kind of careers. There's no like resource library or template library where you can go and say, oh, I want to be great at documentation. What are all the templates I need to do that? We're thinking about that at HubSpot. The other thing that we're doing at HubSpot that I have to plug is, if you're familiar with HubSpot, you know we have an awesome academy team that not only teaches you about the HubSpot product, but teaches you how to just do these core concepts. And so building up our Rev-Ops programming and academy is something we're really working on. You know, there's no educational standards for Rev-Ops. You can't go to like Rev-Ops school, and you can't go graduate and get your certification and kind of prove what you've learned and what you can do. So that's something that we're working on too.
Perfect. I put some of those names in there that you mentioned.
Awesome.
And after this, what I'll do is with our like follow-up email with the video and the deck, if you're happy for us to share the deck, I'll make sure that the link to the HubSpot community that you mentioned as
That'd
well.
be awesome. Great.
Maggie, that was awesome. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I love talking about Rev-Ops. I'm excited.
Well, we'll have to get you back to do another session at some point.
Sounds great.
Thanks, Maggie. Thanks for joining us, everybody.